Good afternoon. I'm Jana Martin, Chief Executive Officer of the American Insurance Trust, known to most of you simply as the Trust. We're delighted again that you're able to join us virtually today for the next webinar in our virtual webinar series. The Trust is pleased to once again partner with Drs. Sarah Smucker-Barnwell and Margot Adams-Larson to present these telehealth community chats. They've done a tremendous job with the series, and I know I and our policyholders appreciate their expertise and the time and effort that goes into putting these together. I hope you enjoy and benefit from our telehealth chat today. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Smucker-Barnwell and Adams-Larson. Thank you very much, ladies.
Thank you so much, Dr. Martin, and thank you to the Trust for having us today. Thanks to everyone who's taken time to come be with us. And thanks so much, Margot. I'm delighted to see you and to again have another opportunity to talk telehealth.
I am excited to be here as well. And thank you to everyone for hopping on. I really, truly find this to be one of the best parts of my month. So with that.
So we always like to start off with our disclosures that in our professional lives, both of us do participate in telehealth training. So in as much as that is the case, we have a horse in the race of telehealth, but I think that probably would have been the case otherwise. And always the disclosure that when presenting about technology, inevitably you will do something dorky in the context of technology.
Or it might fail, but we'll move along. This is our quarterly check-in now, and there's been quite a bit going on for us to talk about. We've had a number of questions coming in, and our goal is really to address those questions from the practical how-to with a flair of ethical perspective taking and just thinking about what are the things to think through in some of the conundrums or challenges that we're sometimes really scratching our heads to figure out in terms of telehealth and telepsychology. So thank you to all of those who have submitted questions ahead of time. We pull them from our evaluations. We pull them from some of the last chat that we didn't get to answer live. And we also pull them out of emails. So thanks again for that. We don't have slides as part of this chat and conversation. We find a lot of it's on the fly, so it's kind of hard to prepare those slides ahead of time. But we do try and make some of that information available through the chat, through the Trust following if we need to follow up with things. So without further ado, we have quite the agenda today, Sarah. We kind of pulled a number of timely topics together. And also we've had some questions about some new things on the horizon related to technology and psychology. And I think we'll start off with that topic, which is digital therapeutics. And I know this is going to be a new topic for some folks. It's really the marriage of technology into our practice related to empirically validated science and bringing in how digital technology can help augment, or I think sometimes people may have a concern that it might replace us in some ways. And I'm not totally alarmed about that because I don't think that we're there yet. But it really is this idea of using empirically validated treatment approaches and the assets of technology and software and applications that can really help give us some and patients some information that we might not be as aware or as able to collect for ourselves. For example, we may use a device for tracking our steps in terms of how we're doing with a behavioral activation goal of increasing our activity. Or we might have something that's a lot more complicated that may include some AI, artificial intelligence analysis of kind of information that we're journaling about or putting into an app to really help us with kind of managing how we're thinking about our thoughts and maybe from a cognitive behavioral standpoint. So I'm not describing any one specific digital therapeutic tool, but just giving you the idea that it really is the flair of combining what we know is available to us through software and applications and bringing that into a digital health atmosphere. And that could be through a device. It could be as information coming from a device that we talk about in therapy, or it could be something that maybe is a game that's created from a therapeutic environment that we utilize with certain patients to help them pay more attention or focus differently in different conditions. So lots of different ways that this can come into our practice. And one of the things that I really want to emphasize is the idea that digital therapeutics really follow a research and development or research and design path, meaning that they're evaluated from a clinical standpoint, kind of similar to what we see in pharmacology, where there's a lot of trials and clinical trials to really demonstrate the efficacy and evidence for those tools. So just to give folks a bit of a background of kind of what we're talking about when we're talking about digital therapeutics, some of what I've already described may be sparking your thoughts about, oh, does that need to be HIPAA compliant or FDA approved? And these are really some new things on the horizon. And there are a few that are coming out through FDA clearance. And that really is an extra layer of scrutiny that is put into digital therapeutics, maybe when they're in an area that we really want to have very focused patient safety evaluations, for example, in substance abuse treatment areas or high-risk conditions. So what comes along with FDA clearance is similar to what we see in pharmacology, where we may be thinking about a prescription process for those specific FDA approved digital therapeutics, which is a little different to kind of what's out there on the market for some of the other digital therapeutics. So hopefully that gives a little bit of a background to this conversation. And I know that's a little bit more than we usually provide, but I wanted to introduce folks to this topic because it really is kind of new on, I think, a lot of people's horizons. And we've had a few questions about how do we integrate these into practice? And I'm actually going to throw that out to you, Sarah, in terms of talking a little bit about how you may use these in your practice.
Absolutely. And I think this is a really exciting topic because often when we talk about telehealth, we think of video conferencing, we think of care that's delivered that way as compared to in-person care. And I find the aspect of FDA approval especially interesting, right? Like the notion that the FDA is examining the content and opining on the appropriateness of the content, I think is telling as to where the marketplace may head. And so, I think there's kind of a spectrum on which we can ignore these or adopt these, to your comfort and to your desire. But at minimum, I like to point out many of us are doing this already. My standing joke, and I've told it here probably too many times, is that if no one ever hears me conduct a progressive muscle relaxation induction again, that's probably okay. There are many of us that are using apps like Calm or like Headspace or, things that would guide clients in homework that we would typically have them do. On the most sort of static level, they can consume this content, they can come back and talk to us. I think we see some large scale telemedicine companies integrating digital therapeutics very meaningfully, wherein their intakes, think of all those PHQ and GADs and, questionnaires that are filled out are delivered online, they're delivered through AI. Even those of us who might use Simple Practice or an electronic medical record may have a mechanism through which to do this. And that then is integrated into the manner in which they can track symptoms over time. So as the client goes through therapy, perhaps they're completing psychoeducation interactively online, and then they're tracking their symptoms. That data is then reflected back to the client like, hey, this is what you've been talking about. This is where your symptoms are. So I think there's this question of how much do we want this in our practice? And increasingly, this is available to psychologists as consumers that, again, on the very static level, we can just have folks working with apps. And increasingly, there are products we can use that integrate into our practice that are going to do things like symptom monitoring, providing, psychoeducation, and somewhat automating those things that we do with great frequency and perhaps regularity. This transitions a little bit nicely into a topic, Margo, that you and I were going to talk about, which is hybrid models of care. I think a theme that was talked about a great deal last time was, okay, mask mandates are changing in many jurisdictions. I know we're going to talk about that later. So now many of us maybe or already have returned to more in-person care. What does that mean, for our practice, particularly as we think about, telehealth versus in-person? And I think what's exciting about this period of time is that we have all been through this unprecedented, period of time in which we were required to gain competencies in telehealth quickly, and perhaps irrespective of our desires to do so. And so, I think we have as a profession risen to the occasion. And I think to think of things as being telehealth or in-person is almost anachronism at this point, because I think the standard level of competence is quite high in our community, and that we can ask kind of higher order questions. So it's not really a question of, oh, is this a telehealth client? Is this an in-person client? Though we may have clients that are exclusively one or the other per their preference or their capacity to attend a certain way. But I think increasingly we're going to ask combinations of both. And I think for me, what is exciting is this opens up a question of patient orientation. So, imagine options for clients who struggle with transportation or childcare. I think that there's more opportunity for compromise. This doesn't have to be an exclusively telehealth client if it's burdensome for them to come in person, but we still think it is valuable. We can be in negotiation on some of these themes. I think it's a very relevant tool when thinking about COVID exposures, because although the things are trending, towards opening up and mask mandates being reduced, of course, COVID is still happening. And I know at my child's school, when there's an exposure, there are protocols that go into place, inclusive of some kids learning remotely, if they have been diagnosed themselves or directly exposed. So too, there's the question of, we may have a client who's had an exposure, who, doesn't feel comfortable coming in, but would still like to receive their care. Do we have a hybrid model where we can accommodate folks? Let's say the provider themselves was exposed. This is a nice way that we can help keep folks healthy. And again, digital therapeutics may have a role. So things like, if I'm collecting homework, if I'm, tracking symptoms, does that, if I'm using a digital therapeutic, does that keep things more stable, more regular in the practice? And so I think it's exciting to think about this. Particularly, I like to think of it in terms of expanding provider availability as well. We know there is a national crisis in terms of clinical availability. Folks are very busy. I think we've all been pretty busy these last couple of years, and particularly for pediatric psychologists, this has been a time of tremendous demand and tremendous social need. I know in my life, there are some times that I could have a few clinical hours. I have my in-person clinic, but perhaps I could have a few clinical hours, but it wouldn't make a ton of sense. I live in a city, commuting is challenging. I might have 2 hours on a Thursday. Like, technically I could see clients, but I'm not going to drive across town and do all that to have 2 clients and then drive all the way back. That just doesn't make sense for my life. But what if in that instance, I have a telehealth clinic, and it could be quite brief in that way? I like to mention this because I think that we can think in terms of what works for patient availability and accommodation, but perhaps also for making sure that our professional lives, are operating smoothly, functioning well, particularly during a period of time where we need to emphasize self-care, and particularly during a period of time where there's so much demand placed on our time. So, what does all this mean for the independent practitioner? Because I know many of us are, and much power to folks who are working in other circumstances, but I wanted to have a specific call out for independent practitioners. I think there is this question of how does the availability and real integration of this technology into our profession change my practice? You know, do I want a certain percentage video? Do I want a certain percentage in person? Am I going to take it client by client? How do I want to approach this? And how do I want to bring technology into my practice to help automate some facets, hopefully in ways that create convenience and create transparency, you know, for what's going on with my clients?
I love your thought process with this, because I think it's something that is taking over in America in general, of the idea of self-care, that hybrid work models, whether it's a psychology practice or, you know, a regular business practice, those hybrid work models are really becoming more common to be available. And so I guess the pandemic has kind of prompted us to think a bit differently about how we can really be taking care of our time management and also our care needs. And so being able to offer that both from a provider standpoint, as well as working with our clients to help them have that balance, I think is a really interesting thing to move forward to in terms of our practice considerations. So I'm really, I'm glad we're talking about this today, because I think there's a lot of questions we've fielded over the past year or so about, ooh, when we're coming back to the office, how is that going to look and what's it going to be like?
I mean, my hope is that over time, you know, this is my drum I beat, but the telepsychology will fall out of favor as a word, you know, that it will just be psychology. You know, I don't call it you know, whatever, when I pick up the phone and talk to you, you know, it's radiology doesn't call it teleradiology. Very standardly, they send images remotely to providers for review, you know, and so I think that increasingly this will be another tool, not unlike the telephone, you know, that we use. All of these tools will be expanding. There are a couple comments in the chat that I wanted to call out that were good ones, if I may, apropos to what we were just speaking about. Could we please give recommendations for symptom trackers? So I'm curious if there are ones you like, Margot. I'm a sucker for some old school ones. I still use iMood. I use PE Coach. You know, I use Calm and Breathe to relax. I'm not a fancy lady. Are there any that you use regularly in your practice?
Yeah, it's interesting. I primarily practice with adolescents. And so I actually go with things that they have found or that they find interesting. And so I'm a little bit the opposite school, where, you know, from a symptom tracking standpoint, if a teen has found something that seems to be working for them, we'll use that, or we'll use just kind of a regular old fashioned, just write down the number in your calendar. And so
the old school,
the old school, but you know, they're putting it in digitally in their phone that way. So yeah, I find what works the best is what people are comfortable using and what's intuitive for them. And so that I've kind of meet patients where they're at in that.
Yeah. I think it'll be interesting to see how this develops, because I certainly see a lot of larger scale companies that offer telehealth as well as in-person care offering their own integration of mood trackers and digital therapeutics. Someone asked me to restate the word digital therapeutics. I'm going to say it one more time. She's supposed to say it 3 times. Digital therapeutics is what we're talking about, the evidence-based provision of care through technology. So I think it's about that time in our chat where we pull some of the questions from our Q&A box. Shall I hold forth?
Good. Sounds good to me.
Well, 2 questions that were approximately the same. What are the issues to consider when thinking about maintaining an exclusively telehealth practice for an ongoing period of time? It's a lot of people are asking this question. Maybe we've had the experience of having a telehealth-based practice and we loved it. You know, we're not eager to return to the way things were before. So,
you know, I think this is a really excellent question, because oftentimes now that we've pivoted, we've gotten accustomed to it and we think it's kind of that work from anywhere model. And so a few things that I think are really important to consider is both from your own practice standpoint, that you're having regular hours, you're in your jurisdiction of licensure, because we can get that kind of work from anywhere perspective and think when we're on vacation, then it would just be fine to continue, you know, practice time from the beach, and that may be a different jurisdiction. So I want to always be cautious about that. I think the other piece of that is there's perhaps a patient access consideration in terms of the, you know, population you may be seeing from a telehealth standpoint that, you know, you may not, if you're particularly from a pediatric standpoint, it may be easier for some clients to have care because they don't necessarily have to drive that extra time out of school, or it's easier to have after school hours and they're still home. And so there's access issues in that way, but also in terms of who you're serving and the types of therapy that you want to deliver. And so I think those are all pieces to consider if this is the model you want to continue moving forward with.
Absolutely. And the only thing I'd add, those many great points, and I will, again, in the spirit of 3 times, we'll say interjurisdictional practice. Make sure you're in the right jurisdiction, you're licensed where you're practicing. The only addition I would include would be an investment in your office, your space. I think many of us found in the pandemic, we may or may not have had a nice place to work in our home. Space is at a premium, often it can be really difficult. But as to the extent we are able, ensuring that we have a space that of course is conducive to confidentiality, it's conducive to maintaining the rules of HIPAA and high tech. So, you know, for example, having Wi-Fi that is secured with a password, you know, having hardware that we use and software that we use that is protected by a password. We're really treating our equipment like it is protected health information, because it is. And that we are investing from a self-care perspective in our comfort and well-being as well. I know plenty of colleagues were sitting on swivelly chairs with milk crates and their laptop, and that was great. And that was fine when things started off. If indeed we decide that this is something we're going to do long-term, I really do encourage folks, take a moment, think about where you do your work, how you do your work. You know, if you're in my house, there are certain hours, it's not a good time to work. People are going to school and there's yelling and there's dogs barking, and it's just not the right time. You know, do I have a physical space conducive to my comfort, my well-being? I mean, I'm a believer in investing in that, you know, good lumbar support chair if you're going to be doing this from home. You know, really treat it like an office and take care of yourself in that context.
I would also just add, as we're chatting about this, it is, you know, there's a new market too for folks that may want to work their practice in different hours than the typical 9 to 5, where they may have folks who are, you know, frontline workers or, you know, available at unusual hours. And so I do know that a lot of people have shifted some of their considerations of what is that time frame for work, and shifting to serving populations that might not have otherwise actually had access to care. So just some other things to be creative and think about.
Yes. We had another question, if I may. I'm cognizant of our time. I want to make sure we get to as many as we can, though, as you know, we could talk about this for a country mile. And this is a really good one because I think I know the answer, but we'll see. Are the insurance companies going to continue to reimburse for telehealth? So acknowledging that it's hard to speak to insurance companies as a single group, because as we all probably know, individual commercial insurers and Medicare as well have very idiosyncratic rules. And we're going to talk about this a little bit later on the chat as it pertains to telehealth. My gestalt answer, though, would be yes. You know, we know that Medicare has continued their promise of coverage through the end of 2023 for audio only, as well as video conferencing services, and that they have continued to relax some of the requirements, you know, for video conferencing based services. And I tend to, Medicare is a very narrow and specific type of billing, but it tends to be the case that as Medicare goes, so goes commercial insurance, again, with variations. But I mean, I think the gestalt is, yes, it's here to stay. And that everything I read on the subject, at least, indicates that the insurance companies acknowledge that their customers, you know, want this option for their care. And that I have really encountered very few indications of companies walking back benefits, but I'm curious, it is possible. Again, each insurance company, they can march to their own beat, you know, but I'm curious, you know, what do you think, Margot?
I agree with your comments. I think the other thing that I have seen is differences in different states or jurisdictions in terms of what insurers are required to do. And there's been in different parts of the country, I think, some different responses of kind of how is this kind of rolling out in long term. But overall, I think this really is here to stay. I think there's a lot of value that, both the insurers are seeing from access to care and ease of access to care in many ways for folks that may not have been as well served in the past. But we don't have our crystal ball, so it's hard to say exactly what that's going to look like in the future. But I do believe that there's still going to be support for these services.
To me, the $1 million question is not if they cover it, but how they cover it. So, I think in the public health emergency in COVID, we have seen a lot of insurers offer parity, so comparable payments, not only for telehealth and in-person, but as well for audio only, as well as video conferencing appointments. And again, that is the question in my mind's eye, is does that continue, particularly for commercial insurance?
Well, and just to tie that into our introduction with digital therapeutics, the more that technology is involved in the practice or that we're using that in practice, we may be seeing some other factors there as well. For example, like I mentioned with FDA clearance, if these are devices or prescribed technologies, and we're not the prescribers of them or part of that process, we may see insurance companies kind of getting on that bandwagon about what is approved or needs pre-authing in many other different kinds of ways. So I think there's a lot more than just the tele aspect, but there's also the technology support aspect that we could bring into that conversation.
Absolutely. And again, it may not be directly in our practice, but I think the awareness of this is really valuable as we move forward.
Yes.
Well,
I saw a really quick question. It's an easy question to answer. It's not always the answer that people want to hear, and that's about jurisdictions. And just to reiterate something we've shared a number of times, the question was about, being under the perspective that if you're licensed, you can go to the beach in another state and still see your patient as long as they're where they're supposed to be. And that is kind of a myth, actually. And maybe we're turning into Mythbusters here, but different jurisdictions have different laws about who can be practicing within their state. And there's certainly other components. We've talked on other telehealth chats about the SIPAC and those kinds of things, but you really do need to be aware of what the law is in the state from which you are standing in order to be seeing a patient, no matter where they are located either. So you really want to investigate that if you're headed to the beach outside of your jurisdiction, or if your patient's headed to the beach outside of the jurisdiction they're usually in as well.
I hope everyone just gets a lovely vacation, without so much work. I saw a question about mask mandates, which transitioned nicely because we had some questions last time, and I know you were going to talk about that next, Margo.
Yes. Well, we knew this was coming, right? We just weren't exactly sure how a mask mandate or rollbacks were going to be happening, but they're certainly happening in different areas. And actually, federal versus state, there are different requirements in terms of mask mandates, and they're changing now. I won't say regularly, but some federal agencies have rolled back the mask mandates only to put them back in place. And so I think the short answer to this idea of mask mandates is the first thing is you have to know what your state has kind of thought through in terms of your Department of Public Health. It may be called something different in your jurisdiction, but you need to know how they consider you as a provider and the location you're providing services within. So for example, in a private practice setting, as a psychologist, I may be considered very differently than if I'm a psychologist in a healthcare setting in a hospital providing care. The mask mandate may be different because of the location of service provision, not because I'm a psychologist. So you really want to check and kind of understand your practice area in terms of location and what the requirements are. Your public health department from the state and or your county is going to have some recommendations for you. And that's where you really need to look for that. If those have been rolled back, meaning they're not required anymore, then this becomes more of a professional / personal consideration. And so for your own healthcare, for your own, staff, employee setting, employment setting, those are conversations that are going to be really important to have with your coworkers, with your, owners and or colleagues within your office environment, and also with your patients. I think ultimately it really comes down to whose comfort is needing the most security in terms of a mask. And we kind of had a similar conversation quite a while ago in terms of vaccination status, and do we ask or what do we require? And I think at this point, as mandates are relaxing from a government regulatory standpoint, it's really becoming a personal, professional consideration, and it's going to require conversations with those from the environment you work in, as well as those with your patients in terms of their comfort level within the office setting.
I really agree. I think it starts to, first, I always want to advocate for psychologists, and I want to advocate that we feel secure enough to provide those services we want to provide, and that we do not feel compelled to provide services we don't feel we can safely provide. And I think here it gets into the notion of reasonable accommodation. If in my state, I'm not required to wear a mask, but I would like to wear a mask, and I have that conversation with my client and they really don't want to wear one, I think that there's a conversation to be had there, and there is this, we continue to have the accommodation of telehealth. Is telehealth going to be the accommodation that meets everybody's needs? Now, I want to acknowledge there's probably going to be circumstances where folks say, well, I don't want to wear the mask and I don't want telehealth. And I think it starts to get into almost like clinical rapport questions, like having these difficult conversations with clients about our own boundaries for professional practice and safety, as well as, their boundaries for their own personal safety and well-being. And I think it is, in some ways, the mandates were easier because it's like, well, the law says we have to do this, done, and now we're really into a much more gray area in many circumstances where we have to really clarify our own boundaries and values, and then engage a conversation that might not be an easy one.
And I think, there's the pros and cons, right? Like when you're on telehealth, there's behavioral observations that you're missing, right? That are, now conversations we're having and asking more details about that we might not be able to see on camera. But if we're in the office and masked, we may be missing some, important facial expressions and, even just hearing. A lot of people do focus on lips. And so there's pros and cons, and all of that needs to be a conversation, I think, and navigated in a professional manner, but also keeping everybody's needs at kind of that conversation level and figuring out how we can best meet all of those things. And maybe sometimes that's actually a referral to a different provider to maybe be able to provide that care if somebody is wanting to be in the office and wanting to be unmasked, and that's not the comfort level for either of those parties.
If that's not a service I provide, and I appreciate someone mentioned like, well, what if the state's banning mask mandates? And I think the question is, are you providing the service? And for somebody like me, I'm someone who's still masked. I'm a higher risk person. I think that's the right choice for me. I'm not saying it should be everyone's choice, but it's mine. And, I could see someone in person with masks, and if they just didn't want to do that, I understand, they're itchy and nobody likes them. I could see them over telehealth. And if they don't want to do that, I could help them find a collegial referral. Just as when someone comes to me and they would like to be treated, let's say for an eating disorder. Well, what an important course of treatment. And it's not something I do. I don't have that particular specialty. And so it's not a service I offer, and so in that case, I would be helping find a referral, to make sure that person was well cared for and got what they needed.
It really comes down to that mindset of understanding that you don't have to treat everybody. And it's okay as long as you're helping them find the treatment they need, that, we can navigate this and be helpful citizens in our professional world, but we don't have to take everything on for ourselves. And really understanding that can open the door to a lot of solutions that we may not be thinking of.
And I think psychologists, in my lived experience, are lovely people who want to help. It's a really hard thing to ingest the truth of all these things. Yeah. All right. We had some questions last time about telehealth codes. And I think I answered it clear as mud. And I was going to take another stab. So I'm going to ask for grace and kindness as I do my very best. I'm going to go over the information that I know to be true, 100%, no doubts in my mind. And then we're going to have a little audience participation as we figure out some things together. Okay. So, last time we had some questions, Margot, about the treatment of video conferencing appointments and telephone appointments for those who bill Medicare. And I want to be very clear that we are talking specifically the narrow world of billing Medicare. Now, again, as Medicare goes, a lot of commercial insurance follows their lead. So it's often, even if you don't bill Medicare, it can be very informative to know what they are doing. So a thing that has happened during the public health emergency, that is the pandemic, is Medicare came out and said, we will reimburse those telephone appointments the same as video conferencing appointments. And this is, I think, a wonderful advancement for many reasons. And what they said was, to go ahead and code those appointments as you would your video conference appointments typically. So use that same CPT code that you would use for video conferencing care, which, by the way, is the same as you use for in-person care. So for example, if you were doing an intake, it's 90791, I believe. If you're doing an hour-long appointment, it's 90837, and so forth. Whatever the usual codes you use in your practice to see a patient via video conferencing, you could now use for telephone. Again, and this has been the case for many years, actually, they want you to use that modifier code, that code that follows the CPT code 95. And that lets Medicare know that that is a telehealth appointment. Again, it could be audio, could be video. So it's going to be reimbursed the same, and that is good. This I know to be true. Here's where it gets a little confusing, perhaps a lot confusing. As of January, and actually a little before it was known, but it was announced as of January, there was a new telehealth code. Again, we're just talking about Medicare, and a lot of commercial insurers are following suit. Medicare has expanded the codes available to indicate an appointment as telehealth for place of service. So place of service, or it's sometimes called the POS code, is that code we use that indicates where you were when this appointment happened. So I'm somebody who sees patients in an outpatient, plain old office. There's a specific code for that. Some years ago, Medicare had come out and said, well, if you're seeing someone over telehealth, you could use the code 02 for place of service. And that indicates that's a telehealth appointment. Now, as of this year, and in fact, I believe it is today, it is April 4th, 2022, that this is effective. There is an additional code for telehealth. The place of service code 1010 indicates that that telehealth appointment happened in the client's home. Whereas O2, where they're keeping O2, they're not getting rid of it, but O2 now refers to any telehealth that's going on outside the home in sites that, you could receive telehealth. So for example, that might be a hospital, that could be a school, that could be a prison, that could be many different places. But they made this distinction, 10 for in the home, O2 for outside the home. And again, commercial insurance is going to do what they're going to do. So my counsel to folks is, if you have been billing your telehealth appointments using the code 02 with commercial insurance, well, go check on their website. They may be requesting that you now use the place of service code 10. And now I'm going to make it very, very confusing, and I apologize in advance. I would like to know, and I would like people to put in the Q&A box, how many folks out there are billing Medicare using the code 02? They're using that telehealth 02 code. In the past, that was the one. I'm curious if folks could just let me know, put that on in there. Now, I'm curious, not a ton. Okay, 02, yes, we got one, fantastic. I'm curious, has anyone continued to use a code that they used before? So for example, I have an outpatient office. The code for that in-person care is 11. So that would indicate I was 11 in my office. It's a different code for inpatient care. It's a different code if I work as a hospitalist, etc. Anyone been out there using 11 for billing Medicare? Well, there's not as many.
There were a few noted that.
There's a few.
Back up. Mm-hmm.
Here's where it's really confusing, y'all. Okay, in the public health emergency, Medicare made a statement that said, well, if you're billing telehealth, we want to make sure you get paid exactly the same as you would if you were doing this in person. And they said, go ahead and bill it just as you would in person for that place of service code, but add the modifier code 95. I know this is super confusing because it is confusing. Medicare had a statement that said you can go ahead. And so for somebody like me, I would indicate, well, this is an office appointment, but then I'd also have that telehealth code. So here's my last question to the group. Has anyone done both 02 and 11? You've tried one claim with the place of service 02, one claim with the place of service 11. Were you reimbursed a different amount? Because I will tell you anecdotally, and I don't believe it's supposed to be this way, but anecdotally, I have had colleagues tell me that they have received, a little bit less, not a tremendous amount, but some money less for using that 02 code compared to the 11 code. I want to be clear that in my perspective, neither is wrong. Neither of these codes would be incorrect, 2, now 10, or 11. But the question is, how much are you being reimbursed? So this is my crowdsourcing effort to learn if anyone out there has done 2 versus 11. Have you been reimbursed a different amount?
And, Sarah, I'm watching as folks are commenting in the chat, and I think this is awesome. This is kind of the first time we've done like a little bit of a poll this way. And I kind of am enjoying this feedback coming in.
2 less than 11 is what we're seeing.
Yeah.
And that's what the word on the street is.
Yep. I think there's a few caveats to this. And one is sometimes the technology at the processing agency is behind. And so they're not capable of actually dealing with the timelines that the folks are setting. Sometimes the crossover kind of activity in their software just isn't working right. So I think there's a lot of those pieces. But one of the most curious questions or comments I saw was somebody who is billing to Medicare, Medicaid for, I'm assuming, child services where a parent is in one location and a child is in a different location. So now we've got multiple locations. Which one do we put?
That's just blew my mind.
Yes, we never considered that as we were having this conversation earlier. And so there must be a policy about that somewhere. Well,
so it's a great point that, so I guess let me start. My takeaways are, if you are billing commercial insurance, check with the commercial insurance. They are each unique. And, it's a frustration to have to do so, but I recommend doing it to make sure you're getting the most reimbursement that you can. If you are billing Medicare, I believe it is technically correct to bill with that now 10 or 2 code for telehealth. And anecdotally, people are telling us that if they use that in-person code, 11, for example, for an outpatient office, there's even a couple more dollars, and either is permitted, is my understanding. Now, I want to say, we're going to keep researching this. I would love to have a soundbite that was digestible and straightforward. And we're working on it. So please know that this is a theme that we have been looking at press releases from different professional organizations and entities, and there is a tremendous amount of confusion about this. So at our next chat, there'll be another update on this as we just continue to mow through and try to see, as the rubber hits the road and people are using this new code, what does this really mean for practitioners?
And I do think too that this may be something that rolls out a bit differently around the country. That there may be pockets where there's a processor for these claims that is maybe on top of things sooner than another area. So I think that's always helpful information to know a little bit too, in terms of the area you're in and what you're seeing, and talking with your colleagues about this as well. Others that are billing to Medicare, Medicaid, and having these conversations amongst your colleagues, I think is very helpful because they're local to you, and you can start to have a flavor for what's going on in your community.
That's very well put. Well, I'm looking at the time. I think we have time for a couple more questions. And please know, this coding stuff is dense, it is complex, and we're going to keep talking about it in the chat. So I've had a few folks ask me to reiterate. The new code is 10 for telehealth that occurs in the home, 2 for telehealth that occurs outside the home. Again, this is as dictated for Medicare billing, and a lot of the commercial insurers are going to follow along.
And just to further emphasize that point, it's the point of service for the patient.
Yes.
Where the patient is located, if they are at home versus outside of their home.
Yes, thank you. I think I misstated that. Okay, well, shall we look to a few more questions in our Q&A?
I know you've been monitoring.
Yes. Let's see. I think there have been some really great questions that I see in here regarding crisis management. And, I wanted to mention 2 things. One, this is something that we have covered in prior chats. So if folks want to go back, we hold forth like more than you'll probably want to know. But I thought it's been quite a while since we've done so. So very briefly, I would just hit some of the high notes about managing a crisis remotely. And, the most important thing I would emphasize would be, what is it? The best offense is a good defense. Thinking ahead of time. You want to do your planning before the crisis. So when I am inviting a new client into my practice and I will be seeing them telehealth, maybe all the time, maybe some of the time, I'll tell you, I standardly do this for every client actually, because I will offer them that option in my practice. So for those folks, I am collecting emergency information that includes where they will be when remote appointments occur. Now, I confirm this information at the beginning of each session. I review with them the protocol that will happen if there is an emergency, which typically involves me staying on the telephone or on the video conferencing with them and contacting relevant emergency services if that's indicated. So if they are having a medical emergency, I might contact paramedics. If they were having a psychiatric emergency, I might contact mental health professionals, so forth. I'd like to have a release of information and identification of a support person in that person's life if they are comfortable doing that. It's never something I would press for. I would never not provide care secondary to that. But these are the major themes. And then of course, having folks sign off on that emergency plan and having this be a part of the informed consent process.
I think that is well stated, and always making sure to check in when you're starting a session where your client is located for a number of reasons. 1, to document within your note, but 2, so that what where they are in terms of what you might need to put in place should something arise during the session.
Well, do we have time for one more, do you think?
Well,
Quick
I think
one.
we might be able to slide a quick question
All
in.
right.
We've got a quick one.
Let's see. What type of patient presentations could be contraindicated for telepsychology? I think it's a great question. Can say it quickly. You know, I think that there is not a data-driven reason not to serve one remotely. And that's not me saying I think you should see every client remotely. That's not the case. But you know, the data that we are aware of suggests that most clients can be seen remotely. You want to consider themes like clinical stability, availability of an appropriate endpoint to receive confidential care, access to technology, comfort with the modality. Are they someone that will require your knowledge of local resources? Do they require recurrent hospitalizations? Things like this. The only clinical contraindication specifically related to diagnosis, if a person has ideas of reference or delusion about videos, cameras, recording, sometimes not a great fit, you know, and so that's my short list that I would include.